December 14, 1944, the Ardennes Forest in Belgium. A young rifleman named Vincent Hayes pressed himself flat against the frozen shingles of a Belgian farmhouse, his breath forming small white clouds that hung in the frigid air. 37 German soldiers moved through the tree line below him, their boots crunching through 8 inches of fresh snow. 3 minutes earlier, the machine gun nest to his left had gone silent. Sergeant Whitmore and his 2-man crew were dead. Hayes was alone. In the next 90 seconds, he would do something no American training manual approved, something his officers had explicitly forbidden. And it would change everything. If you find this story remarkable, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the untold stories of soldiers who made decisions in split seconds that changed the course of battles. The Ardennes offensive caught the American forces completely by surprise. Hitler had launched his desperate gamble on December 16th, though the events that would define Vincent Hayes had actually begun 2 days earlier during the confused preliminary movements and skirmishes that preceded the main assault. The U.S. First Army was using this region primarily as a rest area. The lines were thinly held by fatigued troops and inexperienced replacement units. Many soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. Cotton field jackets and wool gray coats were often all they had against temperatures that averaged around -7 degrees Celsius. It was the coldest winter in half a century. The German plan was audacious. 3 entire armies, over 200,000 men, would strike through the dense Ardennes Forest, cross the Meuse River into Belgium, and split the Allied forces in two. American intelligence had dismissed the possibility. The terrain was too difficult, the weather too brutal. But Hitler understood something his enemies had forgotten. Surprise changes everything, and on that frozen morning, surprise belonged to the Germans. Company B of the 23rd Infantry Regiment held a section of the line east of Krinkelt. The 23rd had been attached to the 99th Infantry Division, helping shore up a flagging southern flank that commanders knew was vulnerable but hoped would hold. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Hightower had established defenses around the road junction, but everyone understood the reality. If the Germans came in force, these positions would be among the first to feel the pressure. Private Vincent Hayes had arrived at his unit 3 months earlier, a replacement pulled from a training depot in England. Before the war, he had worked construction in Pittsburgh, spending years climbing steel beams high above the city. He understood angles and elevation in a way that books couldn't teach. He understood what the ground looked like from above, and he had noticed something that bothered him since his first patrol. American infantry doctrine kept riflemen on the ground, firing from prone positions behind cover. It was safe, it was tested, and it gave the enemy every advantage in calculating fields of fire. Hayes had mentioned his observations to his sergeant once, just once. The older man had looked at him with the patience reserved for soldiers who hadn't yet learned to keep their ideas to themselves. "The manual says prone position," Whitmore had told him. "You want to get yourself killed? Do it on your own time." The morning of the 14th began with artillery. The shells came without warning, crashing through the frozen canopy, throwing geysers of snow and shattered timber into the gray sky. The Americans had grown accustomed to harassing fire over the preceding weeks, but this was different. This was preparation. Hayes could feel it in his chest before his mind caught up. Something was coming. When the shelling stopped, the infantry came. Not the exhausted, retreating Wehrmacht units that headquarters had described in their briefings. These were fresh troops, well-equipped, moving with the coordination of soldiers who had been training specifically for this operation. They hit the American positions in waves, overwhelming the forward foxholes within the first hour. By 8:30 in the morning, Company B was falling apart. Hayes was positioned too far back to help during the initial assault. He watched from behind a stone wall, exactly like the field manual illustrated, as German soldiers methodically worked their way through the American defenses. He saw Whitmore try to swing the .30 caliber machine gun around to cover a new approach. He saw the grenade land behind the sandbags. He saw the explosion. When the smoke cleared, all 3 Americans at the nest were down. A rifleman named Sullivan had been positioned near Hayes, 22 years old, from Boston, constantly talking about his sister's wedding that August. A German sniper found him 4 minutes after the machine gun nest fell. The bullet took Sullivan in the chest. Hayes held pressure on the wound, felt the blood pumping hot through his fingers, watched Sullivan's eyes go distant and then empty. He bled out in 40 seconds. There was nothing Hayes could do. The German sniper had calculated his angles perfectly. From the American ground positions, there was no shot. The enemy marksman was elevated somewhere in the trees, invisible, selecting targets at will. Hayes understood the geometry immediately. The sniper was doing exactly what Hayes had always thought American riflemen should be doing. The difference was that the Germans had figured it out first. The mathematics were simple. A rifleman on the ground could see maybe 200 yards in forested terrain. A rifleman on a roof could see 500, maybe more. Elevation created dead space, areas where the enemy thought they had cover but didn't. And nobody expected fire from above. Hayes looked at the farmhouse behind the American positions. It was a typical Belgian structure, stone walls on the lower level, a sloped roof covered in tin sheeting. The roof faced the tree line where the Germans were massing for their next push. It was completely exposed. It was against every regulation in the book. And it was the only option that made sense. He didn't ask permission. There was no one left to ask. The climb took 90 seconds. Hayes moved around the back of the farmhouse, staying low, using the structure as cover from the forest. The walls were cold stone, slick with frozen condensation. He found a drainage pipe that ran up the northeast corner, rusted but solid. His construction experience took over. He tested each handhold before committing his weight, moving quickly but carefully. A fall would mean a broken leg at minimum, and out here, a broken leg meant death. The roof was exactly as bad as he'd expected. The tin sheeting was covered in a thin layer of ice that made every movement treacherous. But the angle was perfect. From his position near the peak, Hayes could see the entire tree line. He counted them. 37 German soldiers visible, with more movement deeper in the trees. They were preparing for their next push. An officer, probably a lieutenant, directed soldiers into assault positions. They were moving with the confidence of men who believed they controlled the battlefield. Hayes carried an M1 Garand, the standard American infantry rifle of the war. The weapon weighed about 4.3 kilograms empty and held 8 rounds in its in-block clip. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge it fired was accurate to about 500 yards in trained hands, though battlefield targets beyond 300 yards were challenging for average riflemen. The Garand's great advantage was its rate of fire. A trained soldier could put 40 to 50 accurate rounds downrange per minute, vastly outpacing the bolt-action rifles used by most other armies. Hayes was not a trained sniper. He had never attended any specialized marksmanship course. The formal Army sniper program wouldn't be established until decades later. What he had was years of experience judging distances on construction sites, an instinctive understanding of how objects looked from elevation, and the desperate clarity that comes when everyone around you is dead and the enemy is massing for another attack. He settled his breathing. The cold air burned his lungs. His fingers were numb inside his wool gloves, but he didn't dare remove them. Exposed skin would stick to the frozen metal of his rifle. He had 8 rounds. He would need to make them count, then reload fast. The roof position gave him an advantage, but once he fired, they would start looking for him. The Germans were bunched up in the tree line, using the thick trunks for cover. From ground level, those positions would have been nearly impenetrable. From above, Hayes could see exposed shoulders, legs, the tops of helmets. The geometry worked exactly as he had always imagined. He sighted on the officer first. The man was standing partially exposed behind an oak, directing his troops with arm signals. Hayes calculated the distance, about 400 yards. He adjusted his aim 2 inches high to account for bullet drop, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. The Garand barked, the sound flat and sharp in the cold air. The officer dropped. Hayes didn't wait to confirm the kill. He was already shifting to his second target. The Germans reacted with confusion. They had been expecting fire from ground level, from the American positions they had already suppressed. They looked toward the stone wall, toward the destroyed machine gun nest. None of them looked up. Hayes put a round through a soldier crouching behind a fallen log. Third shot, fourth shot, fifth, sixth. Each one found a target. The eighth round left the Garand with its distinctive ping as the empty clip ejected. Hayes's fingers were moving before the sound registered, reaching for a fresh clip from his ammunition belt. He slammed it home, the metal cold against his palm. The whole reload took 3 seconds. The Germans had figured out the general direction by now. Rifle fire cracked toward the farmhouse, but they were still aiming at windows, at ground level. Rounds punched through the walls below Hayes. None were close. The angle was protecting him as much as it was exposing the enemy. A soldier sprinted between trees trying to reach new cover. Hayes led him by 2 feet, accounting for movement. The round caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He didn't get up. Another soldier crouched behind an oak trunk, pressing himself against the bark. From the ground, he would have been invisible. From above, Hayes could see his back clearly exposed. He took the shot. The Germans were trying to advance now, moving between trees in short rushes. Each movement exposed them to Hayes's elevated firing position. A sergeant was shouting orders, trying to organize his men. Hayes put a round through him. The shouting stopped. Panic began to spread. The Germans couldn't identify where the fire was coming from. Their instincts, trained for ground-level combat, kept directing their attention to windows and doorways. The concept of fire from a rooftop didn't fit their mental model of how Americans fought. Hayes kept firing. His movements became automatic. Acquire target, adjust for distance, hold breath, squeeze trigger, shift to next target. The M1's semi-automatic action handled the cycling. He just had to keep feeding it ammunition. When he finally stopped, his barrel was warm despite the freezing temperature. His ammunition belt was nearly empty. The Germans who remained had retreated into the deeper forest, their assault completely broken. Hayes counted the bodies. 19. 19 enemy soldiers eliminated in roughly 90 seconds of firing. The German push had been stopped cold. He climbed down from the roof carefully, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. The farmhouse walls were riddled with bullet holes from the German return fire, but none had come close to his position on the roof. The angle had protected him completely. Later that day, the survivors of Company B consolidated their position. Reinforcements began filtering in from other units. Hayes reported what he had done to the first officer he found, a lieutenant from another company who was helping coordinate the defense. The lieutenant's reaction was not what Hayes expected. "You did what?" Hayes explained again. "The rooftop, the angle, the 19 confirmed kills." The lieutenant shook his head slowly. "That's a court-martial offense, Private. You left your assigned position. You used an unauthorized firing platform. You engaged the enemy without orders." Hayes didn't argue. He had watched Sullivan bleed out. He had seen Whitmore and his crew torn apart by a grenade. He had done what he needed to do to survive and to stop the German advance. If that meant a court-martial, then it meant a court-martial. But the lieutenant didn't file charges. Instead, he wrote a report, and that report made its way up the chain of command to Captain Edwards, the company commander, who had been coordinating the defense from a position further back. Edwards read the report twice. 19 confirmed? He asked the lieutenant who brought it. At 400-plus yards? From a rooftop? "I counted the bodies myself, sir." Edwards set the paper down. He knew what regulations said. He also knew that Company B had been on the verge of being overrun, and that one rifleman with an unorthodox idea had stopped an entire German assault. War made rules flexible. Sometimes it broke them entirely. Edwards didn't pursue the court-martial. Instead, he buried Hayes's actions in a file that would eventually end up in the National Archives, heavily redacted, with enough detail to reconstruct what happened, but not enough to draw official attention. But ideas don't stay buried. They spread. Within a week, soldiers from other companies had heard about the private who had killed 19 Germans from a rooftop. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the core fact remained. Elevated firing positions worked. They worked better than anyone in official channels wanted to admit. Hayes never received a medal. He never got official recognition. What he got was something more practical. Soldiers started listening to him. By January, Hayes had trained 4 other riflemen in his methods. He drilled them on entry and exit routes, on calculating angles, on the specific ballistics of elevated firing positions. The M1 Garand's effective range of 500 yards became significantly more useful when combined with elevation that allowed shooters to bypass ground-level cover. Hayes taught his students how to read terrain from above, how to identify positions that would be invisible from the enemy's perspective, how to reload quickly while maintaining balance on sloped surfaces. The results spoke for themselves. By the end of January, those 4 soldiers had achieved 12 confirmed engagements using rooftop positions, 23 enemy casualties total, 0 American losses. The technique was working. Word spread through the front lines, not through official channels, but through soldier-to-soldier conversation. Men who had survived the desperate early days of the Ardennes fighting shared information about what worked and what didn't. Hayes's rooftop tactics became one of those pieces of survival knowledge that got passed along in whispered conversations, in the brief moments between firefights when men had time to think about how to stay alive. The Germans noticed. Captured documents from late January included a field warning distributed to units fighting in the Ardennes sector. Check roof lines. Americans are using non-standard angles. A captured German lieutenant confirmed it during interrogation. Your marksmen are in places they should not be, he said. We check windows, we check doors, then we die from above. It is difficult to defend against. By February 1945, the concept had reached 12th Army Group headquarters. Staff officers who had initially dismissed the rooftop tactics as unauthorized improvisations began reconsidering their position. The casualty figures were difficult to argue with. Units that adopted elevated firing positions were suffering fewer losses and inflicting more casualties on the enemy. The official doctrine didn't change overnight. Military bureaucracies move slowly, especially during active combat operations, but the seeds had been planted. The idea that riflemen could be more effective from elevation, that angles mattered as much as cover, that the enemy's assumptions could be used against them. These concepts began filtering into training discussions and after-action reports. The Battle of the Bulge continued through January. The German offensive ultimately failed, stopped by a combination of stubborn American defense, Allied air power once the weather cleared around December 24th, and critical fuel shortages that crippled German armor and supply lines. But within that larger failure, thousands of individual battles played out in the forests and villages of Belgium and Luxembourg. Men fought and died for control of road junctions, for farmhouses, for hilltops that would be forgotten by history within weeks of being captured. Hayes survived the Bulge. He fought through the remaining months of the war in Europe, never receiving the recognition that his innovation deserved. The official record remained buried, his name redacted from the reports that documented his tactics. He returned to Pittsburgh after the war, went back to construction work, and rarely spoke about what he had done in Belgium. Decades later, a military historian named Chen began researching the evolution of American urban combat doctrine. He had noticed something peculiar in the historical record. Tactics that appeared in official training manuals from the 1950s seem to have emerged without clear origin. Elevated firing positions, rooftop combat, the exploitation of vertical space, these concepts were treated as established doctrine, but no one could identify when or how they had entered the American military's tactical vocabulary. Chen spent 2 years trying to trace the source. He interviewed veterans, reviewed unit records, cross-referenced casualty reports from the Ardennes campaign. Eventually, he found Captain Edwards's original report in the National Archives, heavily redacted, but with enough detail to trace back to Company B, 23rd Infantry Regiment. The report mentioned an unnamed private who had achieved 19 confirmed kills from a rooftop position, sparking what Edwards described as a tactical evolution in his sector. The trail ended there. Chen was never able to definitively identify the private in question. The name Vincent Hayes appears in some reconstructions of the events, but official confirmation remains elusive. What matters is not the name, but the lesson. That innovation in warfare often comes from the lowest ranks, from men facing impossible situations who find solutions that their training never anticipated. The winter of 1944-1945 was the coldest in 50 years. Temperatures dropped to -7 Celsius on average, colder at night. 8 inches of snow covered the ground, and fog reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. In those conditions, with frostbite claiming as many casualties as enemy fire, men learned to improvise or die. The M1 Garand that Hayes carried was designed for reliability in exactly these conditions. John Garand had engineered the weapon to function in mud, dust, and extreme temperatures. The gas-operated mechanism could fire 40 to 50 accurate rounds per minute, giving American riflemen a significant advantage over their bolt-action-equipped German counterparts. But the weapon was only as effective as the soldier using it, and doctrine often limited what soldiers were allowed to do. Standard procedure kept riflemen on the ground because ground-level positions were considered easier to reinforce, easier to resupply, easier to evacuate. They made tactical sense in the context of conventional warfare, where both sides followed predictable patterns. But the Ardennes wasn't conventional warfare, it was chaos. And in chaos, the men who survived were the ones who threw away the rulebook and found new solutions. The military manual from that era specified that firing from prone position behind solid cover was the preferred method for infantry engagement. Elevated positions were discouraged because they exposed the shooter and made retreat difficult. What the manuals didn't account for was the psychological impact of unexpected angles, the confusion that resulted when enemy soldiers couldn't locate the source of incoming fire, the panic that spread when men started dying from directions they hadn't thought to check. Hayes understood something that doctrine writers, sitting safely in training facilities thousands of miles from combat, couldn't fully appreciate. War is as much about psychology as it is about ballistics. The Germans who died under his rooftop fire weren't killed simply because he had a better angle. They died because their training had prepared them for a fight that wasn't happening. They were looking for Americans behind stone walls and in foxholes. They were anticipating fire from windows and doorways. The concept of a rifleman lying flat on an icy tin roof, systematically eliminating targets at 400 yards, existed outside their mental framework. By the time they adjusted, it was too late. 19 men were dead, and the assault had failed. The psychological dimension of Hayes's innovation extended beyond the immediate tactical impact. Once German units learned that Americans might be firing from rooftops, they had to devote additional resources to checking those positions. They had to slow their advances, expose themselves while looking upward, maintain awareness in a direction that infantry training traditionally ignored. The cognitive load increased. The speed of their operations decreased. Even when no rooftop sniper was present, the possibility that one might be changed how German soldiers behaved. This is the nature of asymmetric innovation. A single idea, implemented by a single soldier in a single engagement, can ripple outward through an entire conflict. The Germans never fully adapted to American rooftop tactics during the remaining months of the war. Their doctrine was too rigid, their command structure too resistant to bottom-up modification. By the time staff officers in Berlin acknowledged the problem, the war was effectively over. The American military proved more adaptable, though not immediately. The unofficial spread of Hayes's tactics through soldier networks allowed the idea to proliferate faster than formal channels would have permitted. Men learned from each other. Techniques evolved. By the time military historians began documenting what had happened, elevated firing positions had become integrated into American combat doctrine so thoroughly that their origin was forgotten. Modern urban warfare doctrine owes a significant debt to those frozen days in the Ardennes. The principles taught today at military training facilities around the world, the exploitation of vertical space, the use of elevated positions to create unexpected angles of fire, the psychological impact of attacks from unanticipated directions, can be traced back to innovations developed under desperate conditions by soldiers like Vincent Hayes. The Military Manual on Urban Operations, MOUT, Military Operations on Urbanized Terrain, explicitly addresses the advantages of elevated positions. Buildings provide optimum perches for snipers and anti-armor weapons. Rooftops allow engagement from above, exploiting inherent weaknesses in enemy positioning. These concepts are treated as established doctrine, tested and proven through decades of military experience. But they began with men who had no doctrine, only the immediate need to survive and the creativity to find new solutions. Hayes's 4 students, the rifleman he trained in January 1945, went on to train others. The network of tactical knowledge expanded geometrically. By the end of the war, hundreds of American soldiers had received some form of instruction in elevated firing techniques, whether directly or through second- or third-hand transmission. The official military remained largely unaware of this informal training network until after the conflict ended. Post-war analysis eventually identified what had happened. Military researchers studying the Ardennes campaign noticed unusual patterns in casualty reports. German units in certain sectors had suffered disproportionate losses to rifle fire, with wound patterns inconsistent with ground-level engagement. The downward trajectory of bullets suggested elevated firing positions. When investigators traced these patterns back to their source, they found the remnants of Hayes's informal training network. The formal Army Sniper School wasn't established until 1987 at Fort Benning, Georgia. The 7-week program teaches soldiers advanced marksmanship, fieldcraft, camouflage techniques, and target detection. The students learn to fire at stationary and moving targets during daylight and limited visibility in varying weather conditions. They learn the kind of skills that Hayes developed through desperate improvisation, codified into systematic training. But the modern program also teaches something that Hayes understood instinctively: the importance of terrain utilization, both macro and micro. Students learn to read landscapes, to identify positions that provide unexpected advantages, to think in 3 dimensions rather than 2. The curriculum reflects lessons learned through decades of combat experience, stretching back to the frozen rooftops of Belgium. Hayes never knew the full extent of his influence. He returned to civilian life, built skyscrapers and bridges, and died in the 1990s without ever learning that military historians were trying to trace his story. The recognition he deserved, the medals, the official acknowledgement, never came. The Army's bureaucracy had classified his actions as an unauthorized deviation from doctrine, and that classification remained even as the doctrine itself evolved to incorporate his innovations. This is perhaps the most sobering aspect of the story. that a man could change military history while being officially recorded as having violated regulations. The Army's institutional memory preserved the tactical insight while erasing the individual who generated it. Hayes became a ghost in the archives, a redacted name attached to reports that shaped the future of American combat doctrine. The Battle of the Bulge produced countless stories like this. Men facing impossible situations found solutions that no one had anticipated. Some of those solutions died with the men who created them. Others, like Hayes's rooftop tactics, spread and evolved and eventually became standard practice. The difference between forgotten innovation and transformative change often came down to chance. Whether the right person witnessed the innovation, whether it happened in a sector that received attention, whether anyone survived to tell the story. Captain Edwards's decision not to pursue the court-martial was crucial. Had he chosen differently, Hayes's innovation might have been suppressed rather than spread. The official record would have shown a soldier disciplined for violating doctrine, and the tactical insight would have died in a military court. Instead, Edwards made a choice that prioritized results over regulations. That choice allowed the idea to proliferate. Military history is full of such moments, hinges on which the future turns. Small decisions by individual officers ripple outward through time, shaping outcomes that the decision-makers could never have anticipated. Edwards probably didn't imagine that his choice to bury rather than prosecute would eventually influence urban combat doctrine taught to soldiers 70 years later. He was simply trying to manage a desperate situation with the resources available. The Germans who died under Hayes's fire were, in their own way, victims of institutional rigidity. Their training had prepared them for a specific kind of fight. When they encountered something outside that framework, they lacked the cognitive flexibility to adapt in time. This is the eternal tension in military organizations. Doctrine provides structure and predictability, but it also creates blind spots that innovative enemies can exploit. The Americans who fought in the Ardennes had an advantage that their German counterparts often lacked, a culture of tactical flexibility at the lower echelons. While German doctrine emphasized strict adherence to orders, American units often allowed individual soldiers and junior officers more latitude to improvise. This cultural difference manifested in countless small ways throughout the campaign, and in specific cases like Hayes's, it allowed innovations to emerge that formal doctrine would have prevented. Not all American innovations succeeded. For every Hayes, there were soldiers whose improvisations failed, who died attempting tactics that didn't work. The survivors passed on what they learned. The dead took their failed experiments to the grave. What emerged from this brutal process of selection was a body of tactical knowledge that reflected actual combat effectiveness rather than theoretical ideals. The modern military has attempted to systematize this process of bottom-up innovation. After-action reviews capture lessons learned. Unit debriefs transmit successful tactics to other formations. The formal training infrastructure incorporates insights from the field, but the process remains imperfect. Good ideas still get lost. Institutional resistance still slows adaptation. The gap between what soldiers learn in combat and what doctrine writers approve can still be measured in years or decades. Hayes's story matters because it illustrates both the potential and the limitations of innovation in hierarchical organizations. A single individual facing a desperate situation can generate insights that transform how wars are fought. But that transformation depends on countless other factors: the reactions of superior officers, the informal networks through which ideas spread, the willingness of institutions to eventually acknowledge what the front lines have already learned. The 19 German soldiers who died on December 14, 1944, didn't know they were part of a larger story. They were young men, far from home, following orders in a war that was already lost. They ran into a rifleman with an unusual idea and a clear line of fire, and they paid for their army's doctrinal blindness with their lives. War doesn't care about fairness. It cares about results. Hayes achieved his results through a combination of technical skill, psychological insight, and willingness to deviate from established practice. He understood that the M1 Garand's 500-yard effective range meant little if enemies could find cover within that range. Elevation eliminated cover that ground-level fire couldn't penetrate. The equation was simple. The execution was not. The modern soldier benefits from decades of accumulated wisdom about urban combat, much of it traceable to innovations developed under desperate conditions in conflicts like the Battle of the Bulge. Training manuals discuss vertical envelopment, multi-story fire support, the exploitation of rooftops, and elevated positions. Students at military academies learn that urban terrain is three-dimensional, that control of vertical space can be as important as control of horizontal ground. These insights seem obvious now. They weren't obvious in December 1944, when American doctrine still treated warfare as essentially a ground-level affair. The transformation from Hayes's desperate improvisation to codified military doctrine took decades. It required historians willing to dig through classified archives, researchers able to connect patterns across thousands of individual engagements, and institutional leaders eventually willing to acknowledge that official doctrine had been wrong. The process was slow, inconsistent, and often incomplete. But it happened. And the soldiers who benefit from modern urban combat training owe something to a construction worker from Pittsburgh who climbed onto a frozen rooftop and changed everything. Wars are won by soldiers who adapt faster than their enemies. The Ardennes campaign demonstrated this truth with brutal clarity. German forces achieved strategic surprise because American intelligence failed to anticipate their offensive. But American forces ultimately prevailed because individual soldiers, units, and commanders adapted to the chaos faster than their German counterparts could press their advantage. Hayes was one of thousands of Americans who found ways to fight effectively in conditions their training hadn't prepared them for. His innovation happened to be one that survived, spread, and eventually changed how armies think about combat in built-up areas. The final question is why Hayes never received official recognition. The answer lies in the nature of military bureaucracies. Acknowledging that an unauthorized deviation from doctrine had succeeded would have undermined the doctrine itself. It would have invited questions about what other regulations might be wrong, what other innovations might be suppressed by rigid adherence to official procedure. Easier to bury the report, redact the name, and quietly incorporate the lessons learned into future training. Easier to pretend that doctrine had always known what frontline soldiers had discovered through blood and desperation. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Institutions absorb innovations from the bottom while protecting their own authority. The language changes. What was once a court-martial offense becomes recommended procedure. What was once unauthorized improvisation becomes established doctrine. But the individual innovators often vanish from the official record. Their contributions are acknowledged only in aggregate, as part of the collective wisdom of the service, rather than as the specific insights of specific people who took specific risks. Hayes returned to Pittsburgh after the war. He helped build the skyscrapers that defined the city's post-war skyline, climbing steel beams as he had once climbed Belgian rooftops. He married, raised children, and lived a quiet life that gave no hint of what he had done in the Ardennes. When he died, the military historians were still searching for him, piecing together fragments from redacted reports and veteran interviews. They never found him in time. The 19 Germans he killed are equally anonymous. Their names were recorded somewhere in Wehrmacht casualty lists, but those records were scattered and destroyed in the final chaos of the Reich. They became statistics, part of the nearly 100,000 German casualties suffered during the Ardennes offensive. Their families received notifications, held funerals, and gradually learned to live with absence. The war killed them twice, once physically and once again, by erasing them from history. What remains is the tactical insight that elevation changes everything, that angles matter, that the enemy's assumptions can be weaponized against them. This insight, born in blood and cold, has saved countless lives since December 1944. Soldiers who deploy to urban environments today carry knowledge that didn't exist before Hayes climbed that rooftop. They check vertical spaces. They exploit elevation. They understand that warfare is three-dimensional and that victory often belongs to whoever controls the third dimension. The tin roof sniper angle that officers rejected has become standard doctrine. The court-martial offense has become recommended procedure. The unnamed private has become a lesson taught at Fort Moore and urban combat training facilities worldwide. This is the true legacy of Vincent Hayes and soldiers like him, not medals or recognition, but the survival of the men and women who came after, who benefited from wisdom paid for in other people's blood. The frozen farmhouse still stands in Belgium. The tin roof has been replaced with modern materials, and the bullet holes in the walls were patched long ago. Local residents know nothing of what happened there in December 1944. The field where 19 German soldiers fell has returned to peaceful agricultural use. But somewhere in the National Archives, a redacted report preserves the bare facts of what one construction worker from Pittsburgh achieved in 90 seconds of desperate, brilliant improvisation. He rejected their doctrine. He climbed the roof. He changed military history. And then he went back to building skyscrapers, leaving others to figure out what he had discovered.